And on this theme, we have our next speaker has also devoted his life to building peace, promoting peace. And this is Brian Cooper. He is Interfaith Secretary and Coordinator for Uniting for Peace. His tireless work includes running the Scotland office for Uniting for Peace, along with hosting events for churches, interfaith groups, including celebrating the UN International Day of Peace every year. So welcome, Brian.
Thank you very much. After the historic vote in Parliament last August, David Cameron, and I quote from The Guardian, surprised MPs by immediately ruling out Britain joining military action at any time. Quote, "I strongly believe in the need for a tough response to the use of chemical weapons, but I also believe in respecting the will of this House of Commons. The British Parliament, reflecting the views of the British people, does not want to see British military action. I get that, and the government will act accordingly." That, I believe, very well could be, as Vijay alluded, a turning point in British foreign policy. But it must be said, there are voices within the government which are very unhappy about that and want to go back to an active interventionist policy. There was another report in The Guardian also about Alistair Burt, the former Foreign Office Minister, who said Britain was now in a constitutional mess as a result of the vote against military action, because no one knew, would he ever go to war again, if so, what for? So I presume he said, we'd go to war to defend Gibraltar and the Falklands, but what else? And there are those who will want to get a redefinition of British potential military policies. And Philip Hammond was questioned closely on Newsnight a couple of nights ago on this very issue. But he made it very clear, he said, our response to the Ukraine crisis will be diplomatic, political and economic. It will not be military. I do note that as a sign of Britain's continuing military greatness, 4 aeroplanes were sent to Latvia to show our solidarity with the Baltic republics. I'm sure that upon news of that, Mr. Putin was quaking in the Kremlin. 4 British aircraft have been sent. Now, much of what I was going to say, in fact, has been said very well by both Tom DeFern and Vijay. I want to make some comments about ethics in foreign policy. And I'm here indebted to the late Bishop of, I think it was Bishop of Lincoln, my old friend Simon Phipps, now much departed, who said, and he was expert in industrial relations, been industrial chaplain for many years, he said, the key to negotiations and avoiding conflict in industrial relations is taking the interests of the other side absolutely seriously. This is an expression, he said, in industrial relations of the Christian principle of reconciliation. This, of course, can be applied to international affairs. And one of the major problems has been the failure to act on this principle and not to take the other side, even if not defined in enmity terms, to take their interests absolutely seriously. Here I'm going to quote the Daily Telegraph, which I now receive freely at Waitrose. Any of you buying more than £5 of the goods at Waitrose can get a free Guardian or the Telegraph. Now, it's interesting, Telegraph, not just editorial, some interesting articles. And here, Angus Roxburgh, writing in Telegraph, BBC's foreign Moscow correspondent, said, "The West made a major mistake in believing it could build its own security at the expense of Russia's. It has created a situation in which Moscow feels not just marginalized, but threatened. Putin came to power longing to have Russia accepted as a great power, as an ally whose word mattered. He thought he was getting somewhere when George W. Bush gratefully accepted his help in the war on terror. Remember that Russian bases were used for overflying to Afghanistan. But then America deployed the missile shield that Putin believes undermines Russia's strategic deterrent, and NATO expanded into Eastern Europe despite earlier assurances that this would not happen. George Bush Sr., much wiser than his son, gave assurances to Gorbachev that that would not happen. But the NATOization of the Baltics broke those promises, and there was a series of events which has led, according to Roxburgh, and I would agree with this, Russia felt humiliated. Tragically, he thought he could be the West's friend. And then in 2008, NATO promised Ukraine that it will be allowed to join. Putin made clear that would be the last straw. And I believe Putin sees Ukraine's decisive turn to the West as inexorably leading to the NATO membership it was promised. This would further isolate Russia, bring a hostile alliance right to its borders, and place its only warm water naval base in enemy hands. Hence the scramble to get Crimea out of Ukraine as soon as possible. Well, I'm very, very critical of Mr. Putin from many points of view, but it must be said, it was the most extraordinary restraint on the part of the Russian forces, who were there anyway already under the agreement with the Ukraine. And the fact that only one shot was fired as a mishap, I think is quite remarkable, but also to the fact that no one has wanted to have any military action. This, I think, does mark a step forward, that this is completely off the table, not just because people are frightened of Russia, but it would escalate, we know, out of control. So I think it's terribly important that in foreign policy there should be recognition of what the other side needs and wants, like security assurances, and trying to get those. And what is needed now is not a lot of silly Western posturing of sending a few aeroplanes here and there, or even self-harming sanctions. But what is needed is what Gorbachev advocated after the end of the Cold War, a complete pan-European peace and security settlement involving all the countries east and west of Europe, looking at all their respective legitimate security interests, and getting a framework as to how that would be done. This he called the common European home. Now, applying that now, the West, instead of being antagonistic to Russia, should say, look, this is a real mess, we've got to sort this, we must avoid this in the future. Let us sit down within the UN and hammer out the kind of security framework that is acceptable to all parties. And that is the Christian and other faithmen's reconciliation put into political effect. The other thing I think also is very important is truth-telling and recognise you get things wrong. I mean, extraordinary, the hypocrisy of the West, and this has been flagged up by previous speakers, but for America, of all people, to lecture us on interventionism is really quite bizarre. I mean, if you study the history of Latin America in the 20th century, there were endless interventions. I mean, the common statement was, send in the Marines. When you think of Guatemala, El Salvador, many other, Chile, etc., endless interventions. So is it possible to move away from hypocrisy in foreign affairs to a little humility, a little truth-telling? Now, emphasis on soft power. Yes, I agree this should be very hard-nosed and be realistic. And I think that we've criticised the government. I think they're doing pretty well on aid. I think Cameron actually has done well to stand up to all those in his own party who say, we don't want international aid. So I think he may be trying to do his, keep the Tory brand clean, but nevertheless, it is an achievement. And I think we should support all the governments in keeping to our target of the 0.7% of the UN target. It's to Britain's credit that we're now doing this. And that's one of the aspects of soft power, which is very important, I think, if we try and reorient foreign policy away from a constant military reflex to one which emphasises cultural contacts, diplomatic contacts. And I would also say the importance of what we used to call people-to-people contacts. I learnt much of my peace work in Coventry, a city recognised for its international links with many countries, once East and Western Europe, now internationally. And there was a great deal of people-to-people peacemaking. bypassing governments and their policies, but people from one country, one city, one area, going to meet their counterparts in other cities, other countries, other areas, and really doing peace work on the ground, building the kinds of relationships that will make antagonistic stereotypes impossible. And I think we need to re-emphasise that. And I think we ought to finally want to raise the question, whenever a British international policy is put forward, we should always ask internationally, will this help to feed the millions who go hungry? Will it help to house the millions who are ill-housed? Will it help to bring schools to those who lack schooling? Will it help to bring medical support to those who lack it? Can there be a fundamental global ethics test for all our foreign policy initiatives? If the initiatives pass those kind of tests, then we should support them. If it doesn't, we should campaign against them. Thank you very much.